Good afternoon. Thanks to Jeff and TJ Hicks at the Rancho Mirage Library for hosting me today. I'm here usually a couple times a week attending presentations like these or checking out books, and I can't say enough about what a fabulous library this is. Like many of you, my wife and I have joined the flock of snowbirds wintering in this community, and this summer we celebrated 40 years in Alaska. It's been a grand adventure, but also a lot of long, dark winters. So after owning a place here for 20 years, which we only visited during our brief vacations, we're spending our second full winter here this year. And I'm also happy to claim an additional modest local credential. My dad was a career Marine, and so we spent a lot of time stationed at Camp Pendleton over on the coast where I was born. And when I was in first grade, I barely remember it, we were stationed briefly at 29 Palms, where one of my fondest memories as a first grader were the giant tortoise races. And I learned a lot about my dad's career as I was researching this book, and one of the surprises that I discovered was that one of his assignments in the Marine Corps at the height of the Cold War was arming what were called Honest John rockets with nuclear warheads for use against the Soviet Union if it came to that. And so the Soviet Union actually affected me at an early age, which I didn't quite appreciate. So today's topic is personal in many ways. And today I want to discuss a groundbreaking time in the history of American-Russian relations, the melting of the Alaska-Russia ice curtain. The term ice curtain, which we use in our part of the world, is an obvious play on the Iron Curtain in Europe, with similar impacts, the dangerous restriction of the free movement of people. And you probably saw just last week the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We Alaskans and our fellow Soviet citizens across the 55-mile Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia like to boast that we were a year ahead of the fall of the Iron Curtain in helping end the Cold War. And I believe the Ice Curtain era, which I'll describe today, can serve as a model for U.S.-Russia relations today, arguably the worst since the Cold War. So after working in Alaska journalism and politics for about 4 decades and visiting Russia more than a dozen times, I spent the last 3 years researching, writing, and marketing this book about the time period. And this photo is of just my second time ever stepping foot in the Soviet Far East. I was press secretary to Alaska Governor Steve Cooper here, and we were some of the first Americans to visit this region since World War II in the dying days of the Cold War. And to this day, I'm haunted by this picture because I can still see the black smoke and oil spewing from this Aeroflot helicopter as we crisscrossed the Bering Sea in 1989. But first, let's get grounded with a little geographic perspective. For many Americans, their knowledge of the 49th state comes from the assortment of wacky Alaska TV shows or from our former governor who was credited with spotting Russia from her house. Anchorage is about 2,400 miles from the Coachella Valley, a long day's hop on Alaska Airlines. And we 800,000 Alaskans enjoy a lot of breathing room. Our state is 1/5 the size of what we call the lower 48. And that's a 2-scale map there. And in response to the most frequently asked tourist questions, yes, Alaskans do accept American currency. None of us live in igloos, and don't try to kiss a moose. You'd be surprised what the tourists attempt. So our closest neighbor, other than Canada, is Russia. And scientists theorize that about 30,000 years ago, the continents were actually connected by what's known as the Bering Land Bridge. So Alaska's history is long, and it remains a dominant force in our state. Even today, many Alaskan communities bear Russian names, many Alaskans worship in the Russian Orthodox Church, and even the local TV news reports the Russian Far East weather each night on the news. And for the record, let me see if I can point out Sarah Palin's house, approximately there. Here you can actually see the close proximity. Well, let me go back real quick. One thing I wanted to note is the Diomede Islands. Alaska and Russia mainlands are 55 miles apart, which you can see here, and there are two islands in the middle of the Bering Strait, Alaska Little Diomede and Russian Big Diomede, and they're only 2.5 miles apart. So I'll make several references to that. Here you can actually see the proximity of the Diomede Islands. And there's a tiny Alaska native village of about 100 people that's perched on the cliffs of Little Diomede, even to this day. And for centuries, there were several Russian indigenous villages on Big Diomede. But the Soviets forcibly moved those residents during the Cold War and replaced them with a military listening post, which I was able to visit with my governor boss in 1989. Just 2 years ago in Alaska, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of America's purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. And this painting depicts that sale with President Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, who's sitting to the left of the globe, and the Russian ambassador, who's standing. And it's worth noting that Alaska got a blue light special deal to acquire what was dubbed Seward's Folly. The United States paid just $7.2 million for Alaska. And today it's worth noting that Alaska generates that much in a few hours of oil production. So we got a pretty good deal. With America's acquisition of Alaska, a lot changed in our relationship with Russia. But one thing that remained fairly constant was the interaction between the indigenous peoples of the region. For thousands of years, these northern people freely crossed the icy waters between mainland Alaska and Russia, mostly in walrus skin boats for subsistence hunting and fishing, and to share common culture and common languages. And during World War II, the US and Soviet Union were strong allies. Nearly 8,000 American warplanes were delivered across the Bering Strait during Lend-Lease to help the Soviets fight the Nazis. But after all the goodwill generated during World War II, suspicions on both sides quickly froze decades of largely productive relations as the Cold War broke out. So, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover decided that American national security interests outweighed those of Alaska natives, and Joseph Stalin, head of the Soviet Union at the time, concurred. So just 10 years after setting up a system which eased travel between Alaska and Russian natives, the two countries erected what we call an ice curtain. They sealed the border and they banned all contact. And this was imposed in May of 1948, and it lasted for 40 years. So think about what that meant. Native families for thousands of years were accustomed to just free travel back and forth. They had relatives on either side. All of a sudden, all that contact was forcibly halted, and family members were stranded on either side of the strait, unable to see relatives or even know their condition. So fast forward about 40 years to the mid-1980s, about 4 decades after the ice curtain was imposed. And there was a drumbeat for change, for more normalized relations that began in the isolated Bering Strait. And I think really it was the result of 3 main factors. First, the memories of these long-separated native peoples were starting to fade, and they wanted one last opportunity for reunification before passing from the scene. As part of my book research, I tracked down some very elderly natives, people who were in their 80s and 90s, living in remote parts of Alaska, who remembered their last visits to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. And they wanted one last chance to see these long-lost relatives that they hadn't seen in more than 40 years. Second, a progressive new Soviet leader comes to power. Unlike his predecessors, Mikhail Gorbachev encouraged interactions with the West. He wanted to burnish his international reputation as a new type of reformist Soviet leader. And third, American and especially Alaskan business and civic leaders detected an opening for interaction across the Bering Strait after these 40 years. This happened at a time of economic stagnation in Alaska, so resource development companies were looking for new opportunities in the USSR especially in oil and mineral extraction. Plus, a lot of Alaskans who had not had contact with Russians, even though they lived so close to us, thought it would be a great novelty to interact with a real live Russian. And so what followed over several years were a series of headline-grabbing initiatives by hundreds of U.S. and Russian citizen diplomats to pressure their national governments to open the Bering Strait. One was by this fella here, Jim Stimfel, who was a bit of an eccentric realtor from Nome, Alaska. Jim came to Alaska in the early 70s, mostly to avoid the Vietnam War, fell in love with a native woman, and moved to Nome, and heard of stories from his wife's family about their interaction with the Soviet Union many decades earlier, and he wanted to do something to help. So he started a letter-writing campaign to Alaska politicians and attempted to contact Russian leaders too, advocating more normalized relations. I was in Governor Cooper's office at the time, remember getting these letters from this wacky guy in Nome. We largely dismissed him, and I think he got the same reaction on the Russian side. He was largely ignored. So he got pretty frustrated. One day he was dumping his trash at the dump in Nome, which is up on a hill overlooking the Bering Strait, and noticed a brisk wind blowing west towards the Soviet Union. So he got an idea. He went to the National Weather Service and talked them out of a couple of big industrial balloons, and he put together little goodie bags with chewing tobacco and sewing needles and notes of friendship translated into Russian by the local elementary school. And he filled up these balloons with his car exhaust and tried to launch them across the Bering Strait. Well, he launched one, it went out about a mile and a half, and fell into the ocean. And one of his buddies happened to be out there seal hunting, grabbed this thing, and came to Stimfel and said, "Look at this goodie bag I got from Russia." So Stimfel wasn't very successful with his balloon diplomacy, but he was particularly persistent and was a key player in this whole effort. Another fellow I'll point out here, this guy right here is Mayor Kalinkin, who was the mayor of Providenia, Russia, and he would rival any American Chamber of Commerce booster for his enthusiasm for his community, and he was a key player as well. Many years after this era, he went into what the Russians call business and was killed gangland style, as was the case with a lot of the Russian leaders of this era. This fella here is one of our U.S. senators at the time, Frank Murkowski. So another Alaskan who was inspired to ease Cold War tensions was this woman, Dixie Belcher, who was a Juneau musician and peace advocate. And in 1986, after a year of trying, she obtained permission to take 67 mostly Alaska Native performers to sing and dance their way across the USSR to promote peace. And her concerts were overflow in Russia, and they got all kinds of international and Russian media attention. But I think the most important result of Dixie's efforts was befriending the fella sitting next to her, this guy right here, whose name is Gennady Gerasimov. Gerasimov was a English-speaking Russian editor of the Moscow News, and when Gorbachev came to power, he picked Gerasimov to be his spokesman. Gerasimov knew American slang and was kind of a darling of the international press. In fact, he characterized Gorbachev's reforms as the Sinatra doctrine, as in, I did it my way. And for that, he won an American Public Affairs Award for his brilliance. Gerasimov, at Dixie's request, made 4 different visits to Alaska, including to Little Diomede Island. And when he stood on Alaska Little Diomede and looked across and could see his homeland, he was inspired to work inside the Kremlin to pressure Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders at the time to approve a lot of the initiatives and normalize relations between the regions. Another person who was inspired to bridge the Bering Strait was a California endurance swimmer named Lynn Cox. And in 1987, she became the first person to swim between the Diomede Islands in nothing but a Speedo, goggles, and a swim cap. And Lynn was greatly influenced by for the idea to do this by her dad, who was an Army combat medic, and he saw the worst side of international relations. And so he used to sit with his daughter, and they would look through National Geographic maps, and he's the one who gave her the idea to swim between the Diomede Islands to focus attention on the proximity between these two regions. So they moved from New England to California so she could specialize, improve her swimming. And she did a series of increasingly challenging swims to prepare for this. She swam Catalina Island, the Nile River, Glacier Bay, and Alaska. And several weeks, even before the Soviets had given permission for her to make this swim, she moved to Nome. Every morning would get up and swim up and down the beach in Nome in the Bering Sea to try to get ready for this. So she put in Little Diomede in the summer of '87. The water was about 6 degrees warmer than an ice cube. And she started swimming, surrounded by a flotilla of reporters and doctors who were monitoring her internal body temperature. They were prepared to pull her if she got too cold. But she swam for about 2 hours and got ready to land on Big Diomede. And the Soviets had made a big deal out of this. They flew in several helicopters full of newspaper reporters and media, and Gorbachev's wife's doctor flew in to receive her. They had a guy in a white suit serving tea and crumpets on the beach. But as Lynn was getting ready to land, they were all set up a couple hundred yards down the beach, so they yelled at her, "Don't land there, swim down to us." So the poor woman finally gets down to the landing spot, and you can see it's pretty icy. And when I talked to her, she said one of the things she remembers most vividly about this experience was the warmth of the hands of the Soviet soldiers on her wrists when they reached in and plucked her out of the water and set her down on the rocks. So Lynn's swim drew attention to Cold War tensions between the U.S. and Russia, and won her audiences with President Reagan and with the Pope. And at a 1987 state dinner with Reagan to celebrate the elimination of nuclear weapons, Gorbachev stood to offer this toast. Last summer, it took one brave American by the name of Lynn Cox just 2 hours to swim from one of our countries to the other. We saw on television how sincere and friendly the meeting was between our people and the Americans when she stepped onto the Soviet shore. She proved by her courage how close to each other our peoples live. So all these efforts and more to chip away at the ice curtain culminated in 1988, 31 years ago this summer, with the first initiative with serious business and political support, which was Alaska Airlines' Friendship Flight. On June 13th of that year, 1988, the first ever U.S. jet departed Nome and sat down on Provideña's gravel runway about 30 minutes later, carrying 82 passengers. About 30 people were native elders who had hoped to reunite with relatives on the other side, business and political leaders, reporters, and other hangers-on. And as I mentioned, this flight took place more than a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one of the natives on this flight was this young woman here named Darlene Pungawi Orr. She was a young Siberian Yupik woman who grew up as a child on an island where you can actually see the Soviet Union. She grew up speaking English and Siberian Yupik, and she was sort of spooked living this close to the Soviet Union. They would pick up Russian chatter on the shortwave radio, and occasionally pieces of Russian military equipment would wash up on the beach. So she taught herself Russian, and she was the only person on the flight who knew these three languages when we landed in Provideña. And so she was very helpful at trying to connect the natives together. And you can see in this National Geographic photo the reunification on the tarmac when the plane landed. Darlene's standing here with a fellow named Michael Krause, who was a native language linguist at the University of Alaska, and I'll mention him again in a minute. So everybody on the flight that day was pretty nervous about our first trip to what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. Like many Americans of this generation, we had practiced hiding from Soviet atomic bombs under our elementary school desks. And just 5 years earlier, in the same general neighborhood between Alaska and the Russian Far East, a Korean Airlines jet had taken off from Anchorage, headed to Seoul, and was blown out of the sky after it drifted into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board. So all of us on the plane that day were pretty nervous. But as soon as we landed, we were greeted as long-lost friends. We were welcomed by hundreds of American flag-waving school kids, and both Alaska and Russian natives were reunited on the tarmac. Now I got a choice seat on the historic flight as press secretary to the governor, and this photo is my favorite memorabilia from that day. It's taken in the town square in downtown Providencia, and I like it for a couple reasons. One, there's only two people in there smiling, not these KGB guys on the other side, just me and Vladimir Lenin off the wall of the community hall up here. And you'll notice the can of Spam. That was not emergency food in case we got stuck in Russia. There was a sort of comedian in Anchorage who would encourage Alaskans to get pictures with Spam in wacky places, and then he would put them in his comedy show. So this fellow, who's a reporter friend of mine, brought the Spam. So at the end of that long day in Providencia, we were there just one day, all the American airline passengers and hundreds of local Russian natives who were bussed in for the festivities gathered before returning to Nome. And let me give you a flavor of the scene. As the day-long visit neared an end, the Alaskans and Soviets gathered outside the House of Culture for a final round of speeches. After the politicians had taken their turns, one of the Soviet officials turned to a slight, elderly Yupik woman with a tattooed chin, a matriarch of the region. Naturally, she spoke in Russian, recalled linguist Michael Krauss. It never occurred to her to speak in her native language because native people over there are so used to being the underdog. Krauss pushed his way through the crowd and whispered to her to speak in Siberian Yupik. She looked at me confused and bewildered. She dare not speak Yupik in public, Krauss said. But then her face and her whole being transformed into this most glorious state. She launched into a completely different speech in Yupik. Suddenly, this was the international language. That was the only language that could be understood on both sides. A silence fell over the whole assembled throng. There was a transformed atmosphere. So the friendship flight and the many initiatives which preceded it launched decades of frenzied, emotional, chaotic, and often successful interactions in business and culture, science and educational exchanges. And after the flight, Alaskans and Soviets simply couldn't get enough of each other. This is a cartoon from the Anchorage Daily News, the biggest paper in Alaska, which I think sort of catches the flavor of this scene. This is from 1988. This Russian woman's just returned from her visit to Alaska and says, "The prosperity of the West is a sham, Boris. There is a facade of wealth, but as you can see, this jewelry I bought is made of moose nuggets." And I'm sorry as an Alaskan to admit this, but we do produce jewelry out of moose nuggets and sell them to tourists. So that's where this came from. So during the heyday of Alaska-Russia interaction, there was just a flurry of activity across the Bering Strait. Alaska Airlines and other carriers like Aeroflot established regular air links. Businesses explored joint ventures from beer brewing to oil refining. Communities rushed to establish sister city relationships. In fact, a dozen were created. And a couple of years ago, when I did a book tour in Russia, I visited the site to celebrate the Anchorage-Magadan sister city relationship, which is still in a place. About 36 Rotary clubs were set up. Alaskan Rotarians were very eager to go to Russia and do what they can. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, they actually introduced this notion of community service. The Soviet Union had provided some of these social services, but they all went away when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so the Rotary clubs did a lot of good work in elderly care, youth programs, and public health, and a number of them still operate. And scores of Alaskans and Russians even got married. This fella here is Larry Rockhill, who was an elementary school teacher in a community south of Anchorage, the Kenai area, and he went on an educational exchange in the late 80s, fell in love both with Russia and his future wife, and has been living in Moscow with her for the last 30 years, has no plans to come back to Alaska. There are a few cases where Alaskans move to Russia for marriage, but there are a lot more where Russians move to Alaska for marriage. So one of the most lasting legacies of this whole era was creation of the American-Russian Center at the University of Alaska Anchorage in 1993. And this was funded by about $26 million in federal money, a lot of them earmarks from one of our U.S. senators, Ted Stevens. And the idea was to try to create a new business class on the Russian side, an entrepreneurial class. And so the American-Russian Center set up 7 business training centers in the major population centers of the Russian Far East. They were all housed with a university and staffed by a Russian-speaking Alaskan and a Russian. And they ran classes on how to do small business. They also ran cultural and educational programs, and I worked for these guys for about a year and a half doing cultural and educational exchanges with a $2 million federal earmark. And at the time, there was really no banking or credit card system in Russia. Everything was cash. So those of us doing any business there had to take in cash. So I remember feeling like I was a drug lord, strapping $10,000 in cash around my body and trying to pass through Russian customs this way. But that's the way you had to do business back then. It also drove our University of Accountants nuts because we had to come back with receipts for all this stuff. Over 15 years of operations, nearly 60,000 Russians were touched by the business development and cultural programs that were run by the university. And the center also brought more Russian students to UAA than to any American university for a number of years during this period. Down here you can see a colleague of mine, Tiffany Markey, who is setting up the Business Training Center in Magadan, and she's got a fistful of rubles there because no credit cards or cash or checks work. So despite all this goodwill and accomplishment, by the late 1990s, relations across the Bering Strait began to cool for what I think are 5 key reasons. The first is the Russian economy simply got too chaotic for most Western companies to work in. There was little rule of law or legitimate banking. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, Gorbachev ran the country for a few years, and then Yeltsin took over. Yeltsin had a number of aides, including a lot of Westerners, who advised a rip-the-Band-Aid-off approach to try to convert the Russian economy to more of a market-based economy. And the result was it really destabilized the country. Overnight, in late 1998, there was a devaluation of the ruble, which dropped the value of the ruble by more than half. And for people, pensioners particularly, there's a large elderly class in Russia who had lots of rubles under their mattress. All of a sudden, overnight, they were worth less than half of what they were the day before. This also had an impact on people trying to do business there. One of the big Alaska grocery store chains had a warehouse in Magadan, and they were doing decent business selling frozen hot dogs and strawberries to the Russians. Overnight, their $2 million worth of food products were worth about $500,000, and so they said, okay, we're out of here, we're gone. And so a lot of other Western companies had the same reaction. The second reason why relations began to cool is Alaska Airlines ended service after 5 years of operations. And when Alaska was operating from Anchorage to most of the major population centers in Russia, it was extremely convenient to get there. It was like flying from Anchorage to Seattle, which we do all the time. You get on a plane in Anchorage, 4 hours later you're in Magadan, you can do business or your cultural exchange. But after 5 years, Alaska had enough. And there were a couple of incidents that I think sort of precipitated that. One time an airplane, Alaska Airlines jet, landed in Magadan in the middle of the summer. Magadan's a pretty warm place, but mysteriously the plane iced up. Nobody could figure out why. But the middle of the summer, the Russians didn't have any de-icing fluid, and they had a big jet engine on a flatbed truck that they used to use for blowing snow and melting ice, but of course it wasn't working. So you've got this jet stranded on the runway, nearly 100 people trying to get back to Alaska. What do? So the pilot gets a good idea, sends a couple guys up to the local market, and they came back with 2 cases of vodka. They poured the vodka in one of these old pump fire extinguishers, sprayed the wings. Sure enough, the ice melted, and the plane was able to take off. A couple years later, there was another incident involving Alaska Airlines jet, which was not so successful. A plane came in and landed in Sakhalin, which is the island just just north of Japan, a big oil and gas area where a lot of Alaskans were doing business. It turns out the Sakhalin airstrip was made out of concrete blocks, and the Soviets from time to time would go out there with hot tar and try to melt the tar between the cracks so you could have a solid surface. So as the plane turned around and got ready to take off again, it sucked a lot of this tar into one of the engines, which exploded. They got the plane back down on the ground. Nobody was hurt, but it created a huge international incident. Alaska Airlines had to fly in a new engine at great expense, and after that, they pulled the plug on their service, said, "We're done here." I think the third reason why relations started to cool was because it was hard to direct federal money to Russia after a while. Senator Stevens had a hard time sending earmarks to Alaska for Russia interaction. Russia was no longer sexy. Most foreign aid was going to Afghanistan at the time. And the fourth reason for the cooling of relations is I think the thrill sort of dissipated for Alaskans who hosted Russians. For years and years, it was a great novelty to host these Russians. They would show up at the Anchorage airport, usually it seemed like in the dead of night, on some kind of like Cub Scout exchange, school exchange, or whatever. We would all go out and agree to put them up for a week. They usually had no money, so you'd put them up, feed them, transport them around town. And for a while, everybody loved it. It was great. But after about 15 years of this, Alaskans sort of had their fill of Russians. So that kind of contributed to the lack of interest in Alaska-Russia relations. And then the final reason for cooling relations is this fella comes to power, Mr. Putin, in 2000. And he was initially welcomed to run the country after Yeltsin because things were so chaotic under Yeltsin. The American business community liked the stability that Putin brought to the country. But it had a downside. He eliminated a lot of local elections under both Putin and under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Local officials, mayors and governors all stood for local election. And the national Parliament of Russia, the Duma, passed a law that encouraged interactions with the West. So if you're in Magadan or Sakhalin and you want to do a business deal or a cultural exchange with Alaska, you had the approval of the national government to do so. Putin pulled all that back in, re-centralized everything. Now he appoints all public officials, including local mayors and governors, and he discourages interaction with Westerners. 3 years ago, I did a trip up the Bering Sea coast in 3 open boats with a handful of other Alaskans. And for a minor paperwork violation, we got detained by Russian border guards for 16 hours and paraded in front of a federal judge and had to plead guilty to this violation, and were each fined 500 rubles, which is $8. It was a big hassle, but I think it was designed to show us who was boss. So today, unfortunately, there's very little interaction between Alaska and Russia, or between the U.S. and Russia more broadly. U.S. sanctions and an overall lack of understanding between the two countries is contributing to what many see as a new Cold War. As I mentioned, in the summer of 2018, I did a 6-city book tour across the Russian Far East. I got my book translated and published into Russian, and I spent 2 weeks with the American Consul General and his team, and we covered 11,000 miles back and forth across the Far East and met with hundreds of Russians. And I hadn't visited a number of these cities in 20 years or more, and found Russia transitioning into a modern, thriving country, largely without U.S. participation. Russia is working aggressively with China, Korea, and Japan on joint partnerships, everything from green building construction to resource development. And the affluence and hopefulness that we discovered in Russia today no doubt contributes to Putin's popularity. His poll numbers are the envy of any American politician. And of course, it helps that he controls all the media in his country and appoints all the country's public officials and determines who appears on the ballot. But we did hear of 2 percolating issues which I think could threaten Russia's current prosperity. First, U.S. sanctions imposed after Russia's incursion into the Ukraine are deeply resented and continue to hamper the Russian economy. And a couple years ago, you may remember, new sanctions were going to be imposed on Russia after the poisoning of that former Soviet spy in England. And just the threat of those sanctions caused the ruble and the Russian stock market to plummet. And the second significant threat that Putin faces is his proposal to increase the Russian retirement age. He raised the age at which you could qualify for a pension from 60 to 65 for men and from 55 to 60 for women. And it's probably good public policy. It's designed to address the shrinking workforce and increasing population of pensioners in Russia. But as you might suspect, the plan sparked protests in 150 Russian cities and eroded Putin's popularity and remains deeply resented. Now, despite this current turn of events, I try to be optimistic about U.S.-Russia without being too naive. And I do believe the model of citizen diplomacy practiced by Alaskans and Russians offers lessons for overall U.S.-Russia relations. And I've gleaned 4 lessons from the Ice Curtain era, which I think are instructive for today. First, we have seen that science can help overcome politics. During the Cold War, and even now, joint scientific research between Russia and the United States continues, leading to promising areas of cooperation. Russian and U.S. scientists, including some Alaskans, continue joint research on areas from permafrost to endangered native languages. And I think the area of greatest potential cooperation in the future is in the Arctic. Keep in mind that half the world's Arctic falls within Russia, and Russia's been operating in the Arctic for centuries. They know how to do so. They take it seriously. The only reason the United States is even an Arctic nation is because of Alaska. And compare that Russia has something like 24 icebreakers afloat to deal with their interests in the Arctic. The United States barely has 2 afloat. And so I think given Alaska's position as the Arctic state, we can be at the table in working with Russia and other Arctic nations as the Arctic changes rapidly. Russia particularly is capitalizing on the open Arctic for shipping and for resource development. And the Arctic is changing fast. As Alaskans, we had the first 90-degree day in Anchorage this summer ever. And so it's getting warm there very quickly, and things are changing in the Arctic dramatically. The second lesson is, I think both sides need to be more rigorous in avoiding diplomatic slights which set back relations. President Obama, when he came into office, he worked with President Medvedev when Putin had to step aside for a couple of years, and they began on decent terms, and they attempted to reset relations, and they actually achieved a fair amount of progress. In 2009, the 2 countries formed a joint presidential commission, identified 19 areas of cooperation from arms control to education, and they had hundreds of people on both sides of the strait, in both countries, working together. But relations quickly went south after Obama dismissed Russia as a regional power, which is true, but it's offensive to the Russians. and he excluded Russia from an Arctic Security Conference with other Nordic nations. And of course, Putin marched into Ukraine, which didn't help things. The third lesson is that I think links between native peoples can build bridges, and today we certainly need stronger bonds in this area. One of the great achievements from the Ice Curtain era was the bilateral approval of visa-free travel by natives of the region. So if you're a Russian native or an Alaskan native living in certain places, primarily along the coast, you can travel without the requirement of a visa. It's not real easy, it's still a sort of a burdensome process, and it needs some reforms and additional funding. And one of the problems these days is there's essentially no direct air service across the Bering Strait anymore, so it's pretty difficult to get there. Unfortunately, just last week, the Putin regime outlawed a Russian indigenous group, which is going to limit the ability of Russian natives from interacting with their international counterparts, and that's a particularly unproductive turn of events. And finally, I believe that Alaskans can help explain perplexing Russian behavior to other Americans. There's a lot of merit in the personal relationships Alaskans established with Russians across the Bering Strait. I think there's a natural affinity between us. We're both northern people, very distant from our national capitals, which we think don't understand us. We face similar problems to which similar solutions can work, from how to build roads on permafrost to preservation of native languages. And there are several organizations that have grown up advocating bilateral cooperation. You're probably familiar with the International Arctic Council. There's a regional organization called the Northern Forum, which some Russian regions are members of with Alaska. And these are great venues for exploring best practices among northern regions. Now, this is a almost final slide, and this is a look from the northeasternmost point of Russia closest to Alaska. And we went up here in these open boats that I talked about. So we're looking east towards Alaska. This landmass out in the ocean is the big Russian Big Diomede Island. Alaska Little Diomede is on the other side, and it's hard to tell, but there's a little tiny mountain here that you can see, which is the mainland of Wales, Alaska, near Nome. And so this shows the just dramatic closeness of the two regions. So let me conclude by talking about one of my last visits to the Russian Far East when I was in Providenia, waiting for the plane to come home to Alaska after a couple weeks and wanting to get home pretty badly. And I'll just give you the flavor of these recollections. With nothing to do but wait, I headed out into Providenia's dusty streets for a few last-minute photos. On the crumbling concrete steps of the community hall that 28 years earlier had been ground zero for the melting ice curtain, I remembered the elation among the Alaskan and Siberian Yupik who had reconnected after 4 decades. I remembered the enthusiasm of the business leaders who envisioned new markets for Alaska services and new Russian resources ripe for development. And I remembered my own relief that everyday Soviets were not the red menace of my childhood, but pretty much like us. As I stood there feeling glum over the passing of an era of such high expectations, a local Russian rushed up, interrupting my thoughts. And recognizing me as a foreigner, he asked in broken English where I was from. When I told him Alaska, he pointed at the eastern horizon and with a wide grin, gave me a hearty thumbs up. So there's a lot more detail and a lot more of the crazy stories about this era in my book, Melting the Ice Curtain. Thanks to my publisher, I've got some discounted copies in the back for sale. And I usually, about this time, say I can take cash, credit card, or rubles. And when I said I would take rubles in Nome, a couple guys came up with handfuls of rubles because merchants in Nome for years, as a kind of a contribution to the effort, would accept rubles, and so everybody has all these useless rubles. But if you've got any, I'll consider taking them. So, spasibo большое. Thanks very much.